Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today we're going to Brooklyn, New York, less than 2 weeks after the bombardment of Fort Sumter. Looking out into the city, we hear the roar of cheering crowds blending with whistles from factories, steamships, and tugboats as Brooklyn boys in military uniforms are marching down Fulton Street towards the riverfront to catch a transport bound for the South. This is on April 23rd, 1861. Along the way, you can hear the sound of music and the soldiers and others singing Auld Lang Syne. It is quite a moment filled with patriotism as the Union-loving patriots of Brooklyn and the greater New York City area are coming together. These men who are marching down Fulton Street to those sounds and blasts of whistles and the people yelling and cheering are members of the 13th New York National Guard. They had mobilized for federal service in response to President Abraham Lincoln's recent call to arms to suppress the rebellion. Throngs of citizens shouted with enthusiasm as they watched their soldiers, their men, most of them dressed in regulation gray outfits and fatigue caps, stepping in unison with muskets and bayonets at their side and full packs on their backs. Overhead, against the backdrop of the city, flags and streamers are floating and fluttering in the spring breeze. Of special interest was an entire company of firemen from the neighborhood of Williamsburg. They were attired in their distinctive red firemen's shirts, the ones they typically wear on the job. They hadn't had time to procure proper military clothing, so they dressed in what they had. The bulk of the 1,000-man 13th New York left that day. The rest of the regiment departed soon after. Accounts of this triumphant march through Brooklyn appeared in various news reports and years later in the history of the regiment. There were others who accompanied these men off to war, namely African Americans, Black men who acted as servants to officers or worked in other supporting roles. The presence of the Black men generally went unreported by the press and undocumented by the regimental historian. And yet they were there. This photograph right here is proof. An earnest young man named Alexander Herritage Newton. He wanted to fight as much as any volunteer in the ranks, but he was not legally permitted to join the army because of the color of his skin, so he went on his own accord. As he later said in his memoirs, I engaged myself for the great Civil War, the War of the Rebellion, adding, my bosom burst with the fire of patriotism for the salvation of my country and my people. Newton knew firsthand the plight of men and women of African descent. He wrote, I was born under the regime of slavery, a free child, my mother being a free woman. My father was a slave, so that in my family, I learned what slavery was. I felt its curse in my bones, and I longed for an opportunity and the power to play the part of a Moses in behalf of my people. I suppose this is the wild dream of every child born during slavery. Newton faced those stark realities of racism in New Bern, North Carolina. As a mere child, he wrote, I looked out upon the world as beautiful and felt that all men and women were good and kind. I did not know of the distinctions, classes, conditions, and grades of mankind. But as I grew older, these distinctions were forced upon my tender heart and burned into my mind. I gradually came to realize my sad condition, although free, and the sad condition of my race. Newton left the South when he was 19 years old. That was in 1857, just about 4 years before the war. He worked his way as a ship's cook to New York. In Brooklyn, He reunited with his mother, Mary, who had moved there earlier in the decade. Remember, she was born free. She contracted abolitionists who helped her buy her freedom from her husband, who was named Thaddeus. As a teenager, Newton participated in the Underground Railroad movement. He wrote, "I was, of course, deeply interested in this means of travel." And he added, "and tried to get all the passengers for this railroad that I could find." One man that he helped, a well-known local slave in Newbern, posed a challenge because he was so well known. Newton devised a ruse to dress him in women's clothing and lead him through town into hiding. It worked. The slave owner searched the town and surrounding countryside and offered a reward for the capture, but to no avail. Newton later explained, "At last, things quieted down and we found opportunity to put him on the mystic train and send him to a clime where he enjoyed his freedom. This was indeed a daring attempt of mine, but it was in me to do it with a great deal of delight. And from that day to this, I've been proud of this one feat of my boyhood life, which was on the side of right and humanity." Newton married in 1859, now in New York, in Brooklyn, and started a family that grew to include a son and a daughter. He rejoiced at the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 and welcomed the war. He wrote, "I had no ill feeling for the Southern white people. Some of them had been my best friends. But this was not a personal matter, but a question of national issue involving the welfare of millions. And my soul was on fire for the question, slavery or no slavery, to be forever settled, and that too, as soon as possible." Undeterred by laws prohibiting the enlistment of blacks, Newton attached himself to the 13th Brooklyn. This is how he got to be in the parade that day, the march down to the wharf. He didn't exactly note what his role was, but he definitely accompanied them off to war. The regiment, the 13th, made it as far as Annapolis, Maryland, when authorities ordered it to Baltimore, where the citizens had recently rioted against Union troops passing through the city. For you students of the Civil War, you know the Baltimore or Pratt Street riots on April 19th, 1861. The 3-month term of enlistment for the 13th Brooklyn ended in August of 1861. The federal government activated the 13th again for brief stints in 1862 and 1863. Evidence suggests that Newton accompanied the regiment on both of those call-ups, both of those activations. The latter mobilization, which was organized to resist the Confederate invasion of the North that culminated in the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, ended after state officials recalled the regiment early to quell draft riots in New York. The 13th arrived a day after angry mobs were broken up by other regiments that had shown up. Newton, however, got caught up in the lingering violence that still continued as the riots were petering out. He wrote, "I ran through the streets of New York like a wild steer while the rioters cried out, yelling words at him, yelling the N-word and other insults." Newton had no choice. He fled the city for his life and wound up in New Haven, Connecticut. By this time, 1863, the Emancipation and Congressional Acts enabled Black men to join the Army. Newton, realizing a dream come true, enlisted in the 29th Connecticut Infantry. That was in December of 1863. Now, with this regiment, the 29th, he was soon in South Carolina. Newton noted in his memoirs, "I was in the full realization of what it meant to be again in the South, not a cringing Black man, but a proud American soldier with the Union and Old Glory behind, before, over, and under me." His return to the South opened up old wounds as he was reminded again and again of the injustices committed against him and his brethren. He wrote, I confessed that I had a burning desire to eke out some revenge, which for years had been pent up in my nature. But his better angels prevailed. He wrote, but of course, from the Christian standpoint, this was all wrong. I was all wrong. I was then on a higher mission than trying to get personal vengeance on those who had mistreated me and mine. I was fighting for the liberty of my people and the righting of many wrongs that belonged to their social and religious welfare. Newton continued on. He served with distinction through the rest of the war as a quartermaster sergeant. You can see him in the photograph here. He's wearing the quartermaster sergeant's chevrons on his coat sleeves, and he has the non-commissioned officer's sword in his gauntleted hands. Great photograph of Newton. He was, after South Carolina, moving into Virginia along the front lines of Petersburg and Virginia, involved in all those actions of the Siege of Petersburg, the Overland Campaign in 1864 and into 1865. He eventually mustered out of the Army with all the survivors of the 29th in 1865 and went to New Haven, back to Connecticut, and became a minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. His wife died early in 1868. At that point, Newton traveled the country and preached to the faithful. In Little Rock, Arkansas, he met a Sunday school secretary. They married in 1876, and he started a new family that included a boy and a girl. Newton and his family eventually moved back east and settled in Camden, New Jersey. And while he was there, towards the end of his life in 1910, he wrote his story, his memoirs. And the title of the book is Out of the Briars. It serves as a metaphor that represented his emergence, torn and bleeding from the thorns and briars of prejudice, hatred, and persecution from slavery. He lived on until 1921, dying of heart problems at age 83. So there's the story of Alexander Herritage Newton, the 29th Connecticut, and his war service all the way in 1861 at the very beginning of the war, serving in some capacity with the 13th New York, onto being his own soldier, his own man, enjoying freedom, wearing Union blue. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.